right, let's dive right in. Today we're tackling the Battle of Midway, but we're going to be looking at it from a different angle, the Japanese side of things.
Yeah, most people only know the American side of the story.
Exactly. It's easy to forget that both sides were made up of, real people with their own motivations, their own hopes and fears. And to get a better understanding of Midway, we're going to focus on one guy in particular, Admiral Temin Yamaguchi.
He was in charge of two of Japan's aircraft carriers in the Kido Butai, their main strike force.
Right. It's June 4th, 1942, early morning. Yamaguchi's on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Hiryu, just a couple of hours away from launching the first attack on Midway Island.
And at this point, he's probably feeling pretty confident.
Oh, yeah. The Kido Butai had just come off a huge victory at Pearl Harbor. They were battle-hardened.
They expected to steamroll right through the American defenses at Midway.
But things don't exactly go according to plan.
No, not at all.
The first sign of trouble. Reports come in that the initial attack on Midway Island, well, it didn't really do much damage.
Yeah, that was a major miscalculation on their part. They just totally underestimated the American defenses.
And those American planes are about to become a major thorn in Yamaguchi's side.
You know, while he's dealing with this setback, American bombers from Midway launch a counterattack.
And they're headed straight for Yamaguchi's ship.
Talk about a stressful situation. You can practically hear the tension on the bridge as the lookout yells, "Torpedo! Torpedo off the starboard bow!"
Luckily for Yamaguchi, they miss.
A close call for sure.
But it's just the first in a series of challenges he's going to face. So what does this early setback tell us about the Japanese approach to the battle?
Well, I think it shows a certain, maybe a little too much, overconfidence. Their whole plan was based on surprise and overwhelming force. They figured they'd just knock out Midway's defenses right away, and when that didn't happen, it threw a wrench into everything.
So they need to adapt quickly.
Exactly.
Yamaguchi orders a second strike on Midway. But there's a big problem.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
His planes are armed for attacking ships, not land-based targets.
So what do?
Well, they have to rearm all the planes, which takes time, precious time.
And while they're doing that, American reinforcements are probably steaming towards them.
And as if things couldn't get any worse, more bad news. A scout plane spots an unknown enemy naval force.
Uh-oh.
They don't know how many ships there are or what kind they are, but it's a whole new problem for Yamaguchi.
Talk about a tough situation.
He's got a major dilemma on his hands. Should he go ahead with that second strike on Midway? Or should he get ready for a possible naval battle with this new enemy fleet?
Not an easy choice.
And all this while, American planes from Midway are constantly harassing the Kido Butai, like a swarm of bees.
It was a real nuisance, kept them on the defensive, plus it forced them to use up resources they needed for the main attack.
You can imagine how frustrated Yamaguchi must have been. His ship's under fire, and he's wondering why the other Japanese carriers aren't doing anything to help.
So he sends a message to his boss, Admiral Nagumo, urging him to attack.
He wanted to take the fight to the enemy.
Definitely showed his aggressive side.
And just as the Japanese planes from that first Midway attack are returning, desperately needing to land and refuel, a new wave of American planes shows up.
This wasn't just some small group of bombers. This was the U.S. Navy.
A much bigger threat.
Way more powerful than the planes that attacked earlier.
The Japanese Zero fighters, known for their speed and agility, they scrambled to intercept the incoming torpedo bombers. What happens next? Well, it's pure chaos. A massive aerial battle.
Dozens of planes twisting and turning, all trying to get an advantage over the other, American and Japanese. It's pretty incredible none of the torpedoes actually hit.
But the attack scattered the Japanese fleet, leaving them open to what comes next.
And this is where things take a really dramatic turn. Just when the Japanese think they've survived the worst of it, they see something terrifying. A huge formation of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers.
50 planes. And these weren't your typical bombers. These were designed to attack ships, and they were about to unleash their fury on the Japanese fleet.
This is a turning point in the battle. These Dauntless dive bombers, they had incredibly skilled pilots and powerful bombs. They were about to change the course of history.
And don't forget, Yamaguchi is watching all this from the Hiryu. He's seeing everything unfold, his comrades' ships burning and sinking right in front of him. But we'll have to wait for part 2 to see what happens next. Last time, we left off with Yamaguchi watching as those American Dauntless dive bombers were closing in on the Japanese fleet. This is where things get really Really bad for the Japanese.
Yeah, these Dauntless bombers, they were a game changer. They were built to attack ships from like these really steep dives so they could hit their targets with incredible accuracy.
And the Japanese carriers, well, their flight decks were completely open, full of planes and fuel, easy
Oh
targets.
yeah, they were sitting ducks. And the American pilots knew it. They coordinated their attacks perfectly, hitting different carriers from all sides at once. The Japanese defenses were just overwhelmed.
It's hard to even imagine the chaos on board those ships. Bombs raining down from the sky, fires breaking out everywhere. And remember, Yamaguchi is watching all this unfold from the Hiryu, seeing his comrades' ships, literally going up in flames.
It's a scene of absolute devastation. The Kaga, one of the biggest Japanese carriers, it was hit multiple times. Bombs sparked fires and explosions, and it quickly turned into a raging inferno.
The Soryu, another one of their carriers, had suffered the same fate. Bombs tore through its flight deck, setting off a chain reaction of explosions in the hangar bay below, where all the fueled and armed aircraft were.
Within minutes, two of Japan's most powerful carriers were just gone. Reduced to smoldering wreckage, the pride of their navy decimated.
Only Yamaguchi's ship, the Hiryu, remained operational. So he's the last hope for the Japanese. What's going through his mind at this point?
He's got to be thinking, what do I do now? Does he retreat, try to save what little strength he has left, or does he fight on, knowing that the odds are completely against him?
And that decision says a lot about Japanese military culture. Retreat was seen as dishonorable. They were taught to fight to the death no matter what.
So what does Yamaguchi do?
He chooses to fight back. Orders the Hiryu's remaining planes to launch a counterattack. It's a bold move. Some might even say reckless.
But you have to understand, in Japanese culture, honor and sacrifice, those were everything.
The first wave of planes, dive bombers, they set their sights on the USS Yorktown. The American defenses were tough, though. A lot of Japanese planes were shot down before they could even reach their target.
It must have been terrifying for those pilots, flying straight into a wall of anti-aircraft fire, knowing they probably wouldn't make it back.
But somehow, 3 bombs managed to hit the Yorktown, causing significant damage. For a moment, it looks like the tide might be turning.
But the cost was huge. So many experienced pilots were lost in that attack, and Yamaguchi knew he was still up against a much stronger enemy.
But he wasn't done yet. He orders a second strike. This one led by a guy named Lieutenant Tomonaga, whose plane had been badly damaged in the earlier attack.
Wow, that really shows you the kind of dedication these pilots had. They knew the risks, but they were still willing to give their lives for their country.
And the ground crew, they knew it too. They worked like crazy to patch up Tomonaga's plane, sending him off on what was most likely a suicide mission.
It's a reminder of the incredible sacrifices made by soldiers on both sides of the war.
Tomonaga leads the second wave, torpedo bombers this time, towards what they think is another American carrier. Turns out it's the already damaged Yorktown, but they don't know that.
And they face the same fierce defenses as the first wave, but they press on, even as they see their comrades being shot down all around them.
And then Tomonaga's plane is hit, but he manages to stay in the air just long enough to launch his torpedo.
A final act of defiance, unbelievable courage.
2 more torpedoes hit the Yorktown, crippling her for good this time. Word gets back to the Hiryu, and there's a moment of, I don't know, maybe relief, celebration even.
Yamaguchi thinks they've sunk 2 American carriers. It's a huge victory against all odds, but the celebration doesn't last long.
Scout planes come back with news that completely crushes any remaining hope. 2 more American carriers have arrived, and things have gone from bad to worse for the Japanese.
Talk about a gut punch. All those sacrifices, all that bravery for nothing. The tide has definitely turned, and the Kidobutai is about to be wiped out.
And it happens fast. American planes from those new carriers, they swarm the Hiryu. Bombs hit the flight deck, setting off huge fires that just rage out of control.
The Hiryu, the last symbol of Japanese naval power at Midway, goes up in flames, just like the Kaga and the Soryu.
Yamaguchi knows it's over. He orders his men to abandon ship, but he makes a decision. He's staying on board. He's going to go down with his ship, taking full responsibility for the defeat.
In the Japanese Navy, that was the honorable thing to do. To go down with your ship, it was seen as a way to atone for failure.
As the Hiryu sinks, Yamaguchi and his captain, Kaku, they go down with her, leaving behind final messages of regret, defiance.
It gives you a glimpse into what those leaders were thinking and feeling at that moment. Defiant, yes, but also resigned to their fate. They knew the tide had turned.
Yamaguchi's story, it's a microcosm of the entire Japanese experience at Midway, starting with confidence, then shock, then struggle, And finally, acceptance of defeat. But what about the bigger picture? How did Midway change the course of the Pacific War? We'll get into that in the final part of our deep dive. So we've been following Yamaguchi's journey through this whole battle, seeing how things went from, total confidence to crushing defeat, and ultimately his decision to go down with his ship. But how did this one battle, this one-man story, how did it affect the rest of the Pacific War?
Well, Midway was a huge turning point. Before this, Japan was on a roll, expanding their empire like crazy. Pearl Harbor had really shaken the Americans, and it looked like nothing could stop them.
Yeah, they had all the momentum. The whole world was watching them, wondering what they were going to do next.
Exactly. But then Midway happens and everything changes. They lost 4 aircraft carriers. I mean, that was the core of their naval power. It was a blow they never really recovered from.
And it wasn't just the ships themselves, it was the pilots too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Hundreds of experienced pilots gone. And those guys were like irreplaceable. It took years for Japan to rebuild their air power, and they were never quite the same.
It's kind of ironic. The aircraft carrier, the very thing that had made them so successful, it also led to their downfall.
Yeah, it's a real twist of fate. And it's important to remember that Midway wasn't just about brute force. It was about intelligence, too. The Americans had broken the Japanese naval code, so they knew the attack was coming.
So they were able to set a trap.
Yeah, basically. They positioned their forces strategically, and in the end, they were able to outmaneuver the Japanese.
So it was a mix of things, huh? Tactical brilliance, code breaking, and obviously the bravery of all those American sailors and pilots.
Exactly. Midway showed how resilient the Americans were and how they could adapt and outsmart their enemy.
And for Japan, it was a tough lesson, about the limits of their ambitions and about what happens when you underestimate your opponent. It really makes you think about the impact of decisions, right?
Yeah.
Like Yamaguchi's choices, but also the bigger decisions about the whole Midway operation.
Yamaguchi's story is like a mini version of the whole Japanese experience at Midway. They started out so confident, then they were hit with those unexpected losses, they tried to adapt, but in the end, they had to accept defeat. But if we zoom out, Midway shows us that wars aren't just won and lost on the battlefield. Intelligence, planning, technology, and even just, the human element, those things all play a role.
So we've really dug deep into this battle, looking at it from the Japanese side. And I hope you, our listeners, have come away with a new understanding of this turning point in history. But there's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, more stories to uncover. Keep diving deep and keep asking questions.